Okay, I'm very excited to have on the Goldstein on Gelt Show Professor David Howden. He is from St. Louis University, but he's based in the Madrid campus, and he's written a great deal about a number of issues that, well, quite frankly, have come up on the Goldstein on Gelt Show in the past, and I wanted to address them. In particular, David, one of the topics that people talk all the time is about unemployment figures, and there are those on the right who say, well, it's not really as low as you think because all these people they're so far out of work, they're not even trying. And yet the people on the left say, listen, we're down at the 5% level. How do we know it's for real?
Well, the unemployment figure, when you look at it, is a little bit hard to understand just by the nature of what you're trying to measure. So when you look at, if you were to look at whether T-shirts are being used or not used, that's easy because if you're wearing one, it's used. If you're not, it's unused. But with work, we decide in many instances whether we want to have a job or not. So it's not sufficient to just say, okay, we've got these people working, they're employed, and these people not working, so they're unemployed. And by that, I mean some of those people who are unemployed might be so for their own reasons, like students are not working, but they don't want to work, or retired people are not working, so they don't want to work. Are not working and they don't want to work. So when we look at the unemployment figure today, it's a little bit on the low side, or it looks pretty good. It's around 5%. And like you say, there's a lot of people saying, well, I know all sorts of people who don't have a job, and Main Street is not doing as well as that figure would lead me to believe. So they're trying to reconcile what they see with their eyes and what they're experiencing with the actual low number.
Explain to me then, how can we get a real answer? It seems to me you could just interview 1,000 or 10,000 people and see how many work.
Well, in the States, what they do is they do interviews and they say, do you have a job or not? And okay, if you don't have a job, they need to decide whether you would like to have one or whether you're out of the labor force. And even more so than the unemployment rate, a more important statistic that very few people are talking about is the labor force participation rate. And this is what percentage of the population is actually working or would like to be working. And just to give you a feel for this, as recently as the year 2000, about 2/3 of Americans were included in this. So 2/3 of Americans either had a job or wanted to have a job. And today we're down closer to 60%. So there's been this exodus from the labor force where many people who used to be included in it are not anymore. And of course, because they're not included in it, now when we measure the unemployment rate, there's lots of people who don't have a job, but there's also many fewer people who would like to have a job, and that's what pushes the unemployment rate down. Let me give you an example, maybe to clarify it a little bit.
Okay.
If you are a stay-at-home mother, and you're doing that out of your own volition, you want to stay at home and you don't really want a job, you would not be included in this labor force. Even though you don't have a job, you're not included in the labor force, and you're not included as being unemployed as a result. Or let's say in the recession back up to 2008, let's say you lost your job, but you were 57 years old, so you were pretty close to retirement, and you just decided to retire early. You would now be counted as outside of the labor force, and even though you don't have a job, America, at least the Bureau of Labor Statistics, would not say that you are unemployed. So is
that because you've hit the age 57? Is that their cutoff point, for example?
It's not because of the age. It's to do with the fact that that person has exited the labor market and they're not really looking for a job. Now,
so that would go back to the first question. Just ask people two questions. One, do you want a job? And if yes, are you working? Wouldn't that give us a better number?
It could, except there's difficult reasons for why you would. It's not so clear cut. There's some people who aren't working because they don't want to work, like somebody who retires early. And then there's also people who aren't working because they've just given up all hope of ever finding a job. And we call these people discouraged.
Is that a big number?
Well, it's sizable. It's quite sizable after the recession. There was a chunk of people that lost their jobs, a lot in the construction industry in particular, of course, with the housing boom. And jobs were so hard to come by that this group of people just gave up completely, and they're outside of the labor force now. They don't have a job, but they're the forgotten statistic because they don't get counted, given that they're not looking for a job anymore. They've just given up hope.
Mm-hmm. We're talking with Professor of Economics David Howden from St. Louis University at the Madrid campus. David, I want to dive into this more because I'm still not comfortable with where we're going on the discussion. And the reason is because you hear in the media so often, again, whether it comes from left-wing or right-wing media, either they're supporting or complaining against one politician or the other. And it seems that the statistics that people are using about unemployment, they're not comparing apples to apples. And as a voter, let's say, I want to decide, well, which party is most likely to create more jobs? And what I think of more jobs is that people who want to work can work. Mm-hmm. How can I make that determination?
I wouldn't look at the unemployment rate if that was what you were interested in, because the unemployment rate excludes all of these people, like this discouraged worker cohort, who have given up all hope of finding a job. And just to give you a scope of this, in the year 2000, I'm just looking at the statistics right now. In the year 2000, there was about 68 million Americans not included in the labor force. And today, we're almost at 100 million Americans not included in the labor force. And these are people who have exited because they've given up hope that they're ever going to find a job, and they don't want to put up with the pain and difficulty of putting out their resume over and over and getting rejected.
Wait, this isn't people who retired, or just that we have more people in America in the last 16 years?
Well, there's also that there's more Americans over the last 16 years. So the number is going to go up with the rate of population growth. But a lot of this number is people who have given up hope of finding a job.
Mm-hmm. So again, I'm gonna ask, how can we know what those numbers are, other than just sort of anecdotal evidence?
Well, the truth of the matter is, when you look at unemployment, there's two figures that are important to you. There's the unemployment rate, and that tells you how many people who have a job or would like to have a job actually don't have one. So the unemployment rate today of 5% tells me that 5% of all people who would like to be working cannot find a job. However, there's this whole other group of people who don't get counted in that. That's these people who don't participate in the labor force, and they're excluded from that figure. So earlier I told you about the labor force participation rate, and that tells me what percentage of the population is actually would like to be working. And right now we're down around 60%, which is a decline of nearly 10% over the last 2 decades. And those people have just either exited the labor force because they're retiring early, the job opportunities for elderly people are not that great, or a lot of younger people can't get their foot in the door with companies and can't get started, or they're staying in university longer, so they're not participating, or some people have just given up hope of finding a job altogether. So you need to look at these two figures in tandem. How many people are actually working? That's the unemployment rate. And how many people out of the whole population want to be working or are working, and that's this participation rate.
And is there any scientific way of measuring the participation rate?
Absolutely. Again, we do telephone surveys, or the Bureau of Labor Statistics does telephone surveys, and they say, do you have a job, or would you like to have a job? And if you answer yes to either of those questions, you are participating in the labor force. And that's how we get the figure today of around 60%.
So how many people say no? How many people say no who legitimately are retired, or real students, or real housewives or house husbands who don't want to be working?
Well, that's the difficulty, but I'll tell you, we can break up this figure into smaller subgroups. So an important one is the prime working age subgroup, which let's define it as 25 to 65 years old, because I don't know, if you're like me, when we hit 25, and hopefully by the time we're 65, we'll be working continually through that period. And right now, there are 4% more people from that group who are not in the labor force, who are not working or don't want a job, than there was 10 years ago. So we've got, you could summarize this as saying 4% of people who normally in the past would have been working have dropped out of the labor market completely for whatever reason.
Sorry, let me repeat that back to you. So if today, between the age group of 25 and 60, people aged 25 to 65, if 95% of them are working today, you're saying that 100% of them were working 10 years ago?
Not exactly working, but working or would like to be working. So in other words, in the labor force. They either had a job or they would like to have a job. More, the statistic says that there's 4 or 5% fewer people, period, in the labor market today than there was 10 years ago.
But that doesn't prove that they are no longer, that they are the discouraged workers. It just could be that they retired, or they're in school longer because they want to get a better job and they realize that education is the only way. I don't understand how we're getting a conclusion from how we can conclude that unemployment is secretly worse than everyone knows, when there's so many factors that could be built into this number.
That's the difficulty with it, and that's what the statistic has a hard time measuring. So there are a lot of older workers, let's say 55 to 65, who are just deciding to retire a little bit earlier than they did in the past. So they're excluded from the statistic. And you would probably think that that type of unemployment is okay. Actually, do you know what? Just to throw out a comment, ideally, nobody would ever have to work. This would kind of be the ideal situation that somehow life would just take care of itself for us. So to say that we want the lowest unemployment rate possible, I don't think that's an entirely correct statement. Because preferably, I'm sure you're the same as me. I'd much rather not be working. No, I like my job as much as the next guy, but I'd much rather not be working and thus be unemployed as long as I could be taken care of somehow. So we've got these older workers, and they've exited the labor force, some of them for good reason. I mean, there's some people who are financially sound enough that they can afford to retire earlier than was the case in the past. There's also a lot of older workers who lost their jobs in the recession, and they had trouble landing on their feet and getting a new job, and they retired early, but not of their own volition. They would have liked to have gotten a job, but at age 57, 58, if you lost your job, it's tough finding a new one, or it's tough finding somebody to take you on for only a couple of years. So at that end of the age group, we end up with difficulties. And then at the young end of the scale, we also have difficulties because if you just look at the progression of the American economy over its whole history, increasingly the educational demands of your average worker have increased. And this means that more and more people have been going to university or college or community college in order to get the skills they need for the workforce. Well, that means that at a younger age, they're not in the workforce, they're studying. So we've got all of these younger people, and some of them are unemployed because they're pursuing their education, and they're okay with this, but that's also making it appear as though many more people are unemployed as there was in the past.
Mm-hmm. Well, we see this is a very good discussion, David. I definitely am getting more of an understanding that it's very, very difficult to understand the numbers that people give us about unemployment. Unfortunately, we're not going to be able to dive into it further because we are out of time. David, in the last few seconds, just tell us, how can people learn more about you and the work that you're doing?
Yeah, I blog frequently at the Mises Institute of Canada, and you can find that at mises.ca.
Okay, we will put a link to that at the show notes of today's show at goldsteinongelt.com. Professor David Howden, thanks so much for your time.
You've been listening to the Goldstein on Gelt Show with money maven Doug Goldstein. Doug's weekly radio show is heard around the world, but if you miss it, you can download the podcast at www.goldsteinongelt.com. The Goldstein on Gelt Show gives you up-to-date financial ideas so you can get on the path to financial freedom. If you'd like your questions answered on the air or off, send Doug an email to doug@profile-financial.com. It's your money for your future, so join Doug every week to build your wealth on the Goldstein on Gelt Show.